Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to this amazing session on World Poetry Day, wherein we will be talking about poetry, its importance. Poetry is a very beautiful thing. It's an expression of emotions. Today, to discuss and talk about poetry, its importance, and how you can make it interesting for the students, we have with us Ms. Santani Govindan. She's an award winning author of children's literature. She has written more than 50 books for children of all ages. Her work includes poetry, picture books, short stories, chapter books, and nonfiction. She has been awarded 2 fellowships in literature from Ministry of Human Resource Development, Department of Culture, Education, Government of India for research projects connected to children's literature. In October 2018, she was awarded a Lok Sabha Fellowship to write a book to introduce children to the role and function of Indian Parliament. Santani Govindan has authored and edited several English language readers that are widely used in schools across India, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. It's indeed a pleasure to have such a renowned author and poetess with us today. Madhuban Educational Books is always committed to come up with the best books, with the best interactions for all teachers, educators, and parents and students so that education and learning can be made fun. At Madhuban, we strongly live by the motto, committed to learning. And with this, I would like to call upon Ms. Santani Govindan to begin with the session today. Santani, ma'am.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that introduction, Himani, and thank you, Madhuban. I've been associated with Madhuban for, as I was telling Himani, my first book with Madhuban was more than 25 years ago. So it has been a long road with Madhuban, and I'm so glad to be back with Madhuban on this important day of World Poetry Day. I write lots of things for children. As Himani said in her introduction, I write picture books, I write short stories, chapter books, nonfiction. But what I like best and what I enjoy most and what is closest to my heart is writing poetry for children. Because I think it's so much fun to write poetry. And I think that of all the things that I write, my readers enjoy reading poetry the most. Unfortunately, poetry in India is not widely read by children. In the English language readers and probably in the readers of other vernacular languages, there will be some stories and there will be some poems. But poetry books by themselves are not very popular, which is very surprising because children are naturally drawn to poetry. Most children are, whenever I take a creative writing session to write poetry for children, I find they are natural poets. What does poetry bring to a child, especially a small child? One of the very important things that a small child has to learn when he or she embarks on his or her educational journey is the ability to read. And reading poetry helps a child's reading ability immensely. Children like to read short poems with catchy words where they can roll the words around, the rhyming words and the words which have onomatopoeic meaning, so that they enjoy the sounds of the words, the taste of the words on their tongue. So learning poetry, reading poetry, listening to poetry helps their reading ability. It also teaches them to listen. Unfortunately, in the modern world, listening is not a skill which has been given high priority. Nobody teaches us how to listen. We all want to speak ourselves and to make ourselves heard. But listening is a very important skill, because sometimes when you listen, you get information which is very crucial and which is very important and which you need to know. But if you don't pay attention and if you don't listen, you don't get that information. So learning poetry, reading poetry is a wonderful way to teach children how to listen. Poetry also increases the vocabulary of children. It teaches them to be imaginative, because a poem is an imaginative way of looking at maybe a mundane or a common subject. So I always encourage parents, buy books which are in verse. Teach children to listen carefully to poetry. Poetry is probably the most ancient form of communication. Much before we had written languages and we had written dialects and we had scripts, we had poetry. Before man learned how to write, he could speak. So when he wanted to say something, he would sing about it. When he was happy, he would sing. When he was sad, he would cry, but he would make a song that would capture his disappointment or his unhappiness. So poetry is probably the most ancient form of communication. It is a form of communication that is very close to man. Speech is what makes us different from other living things. And poetry is one of the most sublime forms of communication. So when you are teaching children, most people will say that we all have got our own, India has got so many vernacular languages and we all have got our own mother tongue. The older people in the family, when they make a baby sleep or when they make a baby eat, or they have a little rhyme which they say, a poem that is basically a poem which is sung in a musical way. And we all know the words of those poems. So we even have poems that when the child is being disobedient and there's a monster coming, so we say, oh, a monster is coming, and there'll be a little poem, so the child gets afraid. And so poetry is an intrinsic part of a child's growing up, and it has much to do, help a child when he or she embarks on the education, when they start learning to read and write. Learning poetry is going to be a great benefit to a child, because it is a playful way of learning to read. Some children have reading disabilities. This is becoming more and more common. And the child becomes extremely anxious if he or she is not able to read. And that unfortunately makes the situation worse. So poetry is an interesting and a playful way of making a child learn how to read, to give fluency, to enhance the vocabulary, and also to enhance the child's memory and thinking and speaking skills. It's also a wonderful way for anger management. Unfortunately, in the modern day, we have a lot of stress. Even children have a lot of stress. And when you are in a stressful situation, hitting out at somebody else physically and verbally is one of the natural instincts. Learning to write poetry in that way is a catharsis. It teaches the child that when you are angry, write a poem about it. Write what made you angry. Why do you feel that way? I do not know, most people are not aware, or maybe you are, that during the Indian freedom struggle, when the British were ruling India and the colonial masters, they were very unjust to the people of India, and there were many unhappy things that happened. So many of our freedom fighters and many of our poets, including Tagore and Sarojini Naidu, wrote poetry in which they wrote instead of being violent, they wrote what they felt, and they brought out exactly what was happening in a poetic form. And that was a wonderful way to express themselves, because even though decades have passed, those beautiful poems still have a message for the current generation. Even though we have long ago got freedom from the British, it is a way those poems teach us how we can manage a situation which may not be to our liking, not by violence, but by expressing ourselves through words. Of course, I write children's poetry. So children's poetry is not so serious, as in you don't have to write poems about the freedom struggle. But if you are angry with your parents, with your teacher, with your friends, or you have had an argument with your friend and you want to make up, write a poem. If you want to give a special gift to somebody for a birthday, or if somebody has done something very nice for you and you want to express your appreciation, write a poem. Now, poetry is a very loose term. There are many, many different kinds of poems. Everybody thinks when you say the word poetry, you automatically think of rhyme and think that you have to write rhyming verses. So I just want to tell you that rhyming poetry is just one of the forms of poetry. There are many different ways that you can make a poem rhyme. There are different, they are called rhyming schemes. There are monorhymes where all the words of a poem have end with the same sound, so it's one rhyme. There are internal rhymes where the rhymes are within the lines of the poem themselves. But rhyming is just one of the forms of poetry. There are many different forms which do not rhyme, but which are as beautiful and which are as interesting. So once you enter the world of poetry and you explore the many different forms, you will find something that will be suitable to you. Maybe you are good at writing shorter poems, maybe a quatrain. There are only 4 lines in a quatrain. And so you are good at that. Or maybe you would like to write a limerick, which is a 5-line, which is an amusing poem. And in that, there are 3 lines that rhyme, the first 2 and the last line and the middle 2. So it depends on what, once you start exploring the kinds of poetry, there is also free verse, which is no rhyme at all. But there is an inner sense of rhythm. And you have to catch that inner sense of rhythm so that when people read your poem, they immediately understand what you're saying and think, oh, how beautiful it is. So I'm going to also read out, how do you write a poem? This is what people ask me, that, oh, this sounds very interesting, but how do I find a subject? Like, I don't know what I can write about. So personally for me, my ears and eyes are always open. I never know when I will find a subject, something that will interest me, which I can write a poem. For example, all of us, when we write a letter or when we work on the computer, the letter I, the small letter I and the small letter J has a dot over it. And even though I'm a writer and I've been writing for so many years, I did not know that there is a name for the dot that we put over the I and the letter, the small J. And it's called a tittle, rhyming with little. And one of my writer friends, she had written about this in her post, and I was so taken by it. I didn't know that I always used to call it the dot, but I didn't know that it was called a tittle. So I wrote a poem. So here is the poem. What is the meaning of the word tittle? Does the question confuse you just a little? Is a tittle the name of a plant, a flower, or a tree? Could it be the name of a bird or a creature of the sea? Is a tittle some kind of insect, or is it a bird? Is it the name of a river of which we have never heard? Is a tittle something? A tittle is something that we write every day. A tittle is the dot we put over the small letter I and J. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't it make you smile to think that a tiny dot has a name with so much style? So now if you were, I was reading the poem, you would have probably got it that it was a rhyming poem. So the first line is, what is the meaning of the word tittle? Does this question confuse you just a little? So the last word of the first line and the second line, they rhyme, and so on and so forth. So every line, the last word rhymes with the last word of the next line. So this was a rhyming poem on a subject, a very, very common subject. I also write, you can also take inspiration from nature. You can also take inspiration from animals, birds. So now I'm going to read a poem about the moon. Now, you must have all heard of the saying, a blue moon, once in a blue moon. Happens very rarely. So this poem is about that, once in a blue moon. Mr. Moon's quotes. When I look up at Mr. Moon, glowing in the sky at night, he is usually wearing a gleaming silver coat. It's such a pretty sight. But sometimes Mr. Moon wears a gorgeous coat of gold that lights up the clouds and is a joy to behold. I know that Mr. Moon has a coat of red and one that is orange too. I have heard that he even has a fine coat that is blue. But Mr. Moon uses his blue coat so carefully and sparingly that it is seen very, very rarely. I'm sure that Mr. Moon's blue coat must be his favorite one. He must be wearing it only when he goes for a party or to have some fun. So here I use the different colors that the moon appears in. Usually it's silver, sometimes it's golden. Sometimes we see when there is an eclipse or a natural phenomena, it's red in color. But a blue moon is very rare. So I used the word blue moon. I made a play on the word blue moon and wrote a poem that the moon has several coats, but the one that he likes the best and he uses very rarely is the blue one. So this is one poem that I've written about the moon. Now this is my book, Chocolate Mountain Stories and Poems. This was written in 1997, 25 years ago, and it was published by Madhuban Books. At that time, the owner of Madhuban was different. The person who was owning the company was Mrs. Chawla. And when I sent her my poems, she liked the poems, but she said, you know, there's no market for poetry, so you will have to send me some stories. So in the book, there are 10 poems and 5 stories. After every 2 poems, there is a story. And the book did very well. It was not a textbook. It was a general reading book. And then after that, we did another book together, Madhuban, and this was published in 2002. It was called Just Imagine. So this time we had 12 poems in the book and 6 stories. But even so, the publisher was not ready to publish only poetry because they said there is no market. And in fact, my first book of only poetry has just been released about 2 weeks ago. So it has been a long wait for me as well to publish an only poetry book. These 2 books are now out of print. You can't buy them, but the stories and the poems are still used. Many of schools are still using these stories and the poems as well. So I'm going to read out some of the poems to you. So this is a poem that was inspired by my son, who was a small boy at the time. He was a school boy, and every day when he used to come home, he would forget something. It would be his water bottle, or he would forget his raincoat or his pencil box. Something would be forgotten. And then when I would ask him, he would say, I forgot. Interestingly, now he's a father himself and has a 7-year-old daughter. And he told me she's very, very forgetful. Then I said, do you remember that you were so forgetful that you actually inspired me to write a poem? So I'm not surprised at all. So this is called the land of I forgot. My mother says I'm careless and too forgetful of my things. However hard I try, there'll always be something missing. My pencils and pens vanish without a trace. I keep them safe, but they are never in the same place. My water bottles and my lunch boxes always seem to be left behind. I search so hard for them, but they are impossible to find. Where are your things? Mother cries in a loud, angry shout. And very quietly, I say, I forgot. I forgot. I often sit and wonder where all my lost things are. Perhaps they are in a mysterious land somewhere afar, in a magical place called the land of I forgot, a place where we can find everything that we have ever lost. What an interesting place the land of I forgot must be, with hundreds and hundreds of lost things to see. Forgotten pencils and pens and lunch boxes and water bottles abound. There are lost purses, spectacles, and umbrellas that have never been found. And the best thing about the land of I forgot is that no one minds if you are forgetful or not. Someday I'm going to go there and have a look around. And who knows what wonderful treasures of mine are there to be found. I will return with a sack full of things I have lost before. Can you imagine my mother's face when she meets me at the door? Where did you get them? She will cry as all my lost things come tumbling out. And for once, I will not have to say, I forgot, I forgot. But till I get a chance to go to that magical land afar, things will probably be just the way they are. Where are your things? Mother will call out in a shout. And I will sigh and say, I forgot, I forgot. So this was a story which when I read it out in schools, children appreciate it. And one child asked me, is there really a land of I forgot? And can I tell her the way so that she can also go there and collect all her lost things? So I think that I also need now, I've also lost many things. If there is a place called the land of I forgot, I think I'm going to have to go there myself before I can tell anyone else. So the next part of our talk is going to be about how we make stories into poems. Now, stories are mostly written in prose, but do you know that some of the best and the oldest stories in the world are all written in poetry form? For example, in Hinduism, the Ramayana, it is an epic poem. It is written in Sanskrit in verse. The Mahabharata is also written in verse in Sanskrit. Homer's Iliad, a famous Greek legend, is also written in poetry. So writing poetry in writing a story in poetry is a very interesting way to tell a story. So I have done several stories in verse. So I'm going to show you some of them. This is called a picture book, The Anger of Apsu. It's a book for smaller children. It's about a small dragon who climbs onto a cloud and floats away. And then after some time, he wants to go back to his mother who lives at the top of the mountain. That's how he climbed onto the cloud. But you know, clouds, they float around. They never go back to the same place. So the baby dragon could never go back. So he had to stay in the sky. And he grew up in the sky. And I wrote this story to show children. And when the dragon grew up, he missed his mother. He ate sunbeams and starlight and became a big dragon. But once in a way, he still remembers his mother and he roars. And that is the sound of thunder that you hear on a rainy day. So I wrote this poem so that children would not get afraid of thunder. Whenever they hear a roaring in the sky, they just think that it's a dragon, Apsu, who is crying because he hasn't seen his mother for a long time. So this is also another poem written in verse, Hiding. And this is another poem. This is a non-fiction book. It's about the wind. All the things that the wind can do. All these are written in poetry. For Madhuban also, one of my stories, Why the Snail is So Slow, we had written, that was taken, now it is used widely in readers across India. And along with that, there is a poem also, which has become very popular. And it is a take on a famous old story, which everybody knows, The Hare and the Tortoise. Everybody knows the story of the hare and the tortoise. They had a race. The hare was so proud because he could run so fast, and the poor tortoise, the humble tortoise, was so slow. So the hare was so arrogant that he thought he will take a nap, because by the time he wakes up, the tortoise will be not even quarter of the way, but he fell asleep. And the tortoise crept slow and steady and crossed the finish line and won the race. So everyone knows the story. So this is a poem, not exactly about that story, but about a turtle who was the great grandson of the first turtle who won that race with the hare. So in this poem, since my story was Why the Snail is So Slow, this poem is about a snail who is also so slow and a tortoise. A snail once to a tortoise said, "What is your speed per hour?" The tortoise answered, "Oh, not much. I'm but one tortoise power." "But didn't you," the snail remarked, "once meet the nimble hare, beat the nimble hare?" "Not I," said the modest tortoise. "My great grandpa was there. You see, the hare went off to sleep when grandpa was gone. And while the hare slept, my old man just kept going on." "I see," the snail at length replied. "I always thought it queer. Do you think if I tried such a race, I need have any fear?" The tortoise smiled and shook his head. "The times have vastly changed. Great grandpa had a lot of luck. Things are now not so arranged that crowds of sporting people would come and keep the hare awake. So what a toil it would be for you, what strides you would have to take. Besides, why should we nowadays be proud to beat a hare? We are most distinguished as we are. Slow motion now is so rare." So this poem has a very important message. Everybody wants to be fast. Everybody wants to be famous in 5 minutes. Nobody wants to do anything slowly. So this is an important lesson. Sometimes it's nice to be slow and to do things slowly. Sometimes when you do things slowly, you do things better. Slow motion is so rare, but slow motion is a good way to do things. So now we're going to take a break. I can see Himani back. Yeah.
That's, ma'am, so wonderful. I couldn't take myself, off the screen even for a minute. And I see all the messages and all the comments that are coming in the chat box, and people are able to connect with each and every poem that you've just recited. Because, and a lot of people have said that we remember our own childhood times when even we were forgetful. Somebody is saying that we...
Yeah, so I was telling my son just a few days ago, he said, his daughter is so forgetful. And I said, I'm not surprised. Whom has she got the forgetfulness? I think all children forget their water bottles and their pencil boxes. So I think they're all happy, and someday we'll all go together to the land of I forgot. Yeah.
True. So I had so many comments in there. They said it reminds me of my childhood. Very nice voice. Somebody's complimented you, and then we have somebody says, "Would love to hear your granddaughter's reaction. Is it different from your son?"
Yes, I know. Yeah. Are there any questions that anybody would like to ask
Ma'am,
me?
there have been a few questions which we have received.
Yes.
They said that how do we motivate young readers to read and write poetry?
Yes, that's very important. And first, I must tell you that whenever I do a creative writing class, many parents have come and told me, but I'm an engineer or I have a business and my son is going to take over the business. He's not going to become a writer. So I always say, whatever your profession, whether you're a businessman, an engineer, a doctor, you have to be a very good communicator. There is no point in having a good idea unless you are able to transmit the idea to the person who is listening to you. Now, even when we go to a doctor, even if the doctor is very good, unless he speaks to us and puts us at ease and makes us understand what is our problem and that he gives us the confidence that he is going to be able to treat us well, we immediately, if he is abrasive and if he makes us more nervous, we go away to another doctor. So the important thing is to learn how to communicate so that people understand well. And for that, the most important thing is reading. So I have grandchildren myself, and all are very big readers, including the one who is only 2.5, but who has already learned how to put a few. Of course, our houses are full of books, so that helps. But I always tell parents, spend time with teaching them how to read and get books which are, and it's difficult, I agree, to buy. You can't buy all the books. Join a library or subscribe to a children's magazine where there are stories and there are comics and things that you can read aloud to them. And I must tell you, I'm of the old school. I still prefer paper and books to Kindle and to electronic devices. I do not like the idea of exposing very small children to too much of screen time. I believe that books are, the smell of the books, the left-right progression is very important. You turn the page from left to right. So that is important. So do not, you may have a Kindle and that may be useful when you're traveling and it does have its benefits, but for a small child, holding a book in his or her hand, handling it, turning the pages, looking at the pictures and answer. And I have noticed with children, they'll ask you all questions which may not be related to the story. But answer those questions patiently, because that's the child's way of enhancing his or her knowledge. So there are many, many books which are in verse. So you can buy those books. Not that many published in India, but there are lots of many new publishers now who are bringing out. Pratham Story Weaver has got lovely books which are in verse. Yeah, so we have a new crop of publishers which bring out beautifully illustrated books in verse. So this is a way to inculcate the habit of reading. For me, of course, I'm a writer, but I honestly think communication is key. Many times people get into trouble because they're not able to communicate effectively as adults. So teach them to communicate and to be articulate and lucid and coherent. And it's important, the more you read, your mind becomes broader and you understand other people's point of view. We are not always correct and our viewpoint is not the most important. Sometimes it is important for us to listen to what others have to say. So I think this is an important skill that children need to learn, because as they grow up, we don't know what their circumstances are. To have an open mind, a creative mind is always going to be an asset.
That's very true, ma'am. And like you said, I would like to reiterate what you said at the beginning, since some people have recently joined us, that, poetry is not only writing poems. It's not only, that some people have that skill. It's also expressing yourselves. It's
That's
also coming, you're angry. You,
yes,
instead of lashing out at somebody, just write it down and make it into a poem that's going to diversify your energy and also calm you down. So,
exactly. Yes. When
and
you
I
write
think,
a poem, when you're angry, and maybe 6 months later, when you read the poem, you'll say, why was I so excited? But at that moment, you feel you want to, hit somebody, scold somebody, use bad words, which otherwise then later, if you write a poem, you have nothing to regret. You
true.
have not done anything wrong. And when you read the poem, you will understand. Perhaps you have a work of art, which you can utilize later. And that is a memory for you.
And this is something that children, if they're trained, it is a lifelong skill. And they
Yes.
can not just in English, in Hindi, poetry can be expressed and written in any language of your own choice and of your own.
Yes, I must tell you, I teach all across India. Now, of course, in the COVID, so one of the things that I do is when we go to some classes, I ask the children to write in metaphors and similes. Like, my family is a jungle. And so you have to write about your family using metaphors and similes. My family is like a jungle. And the moment I read what the children have written, I immediately know what is their mental situation. I remember once it was in a faraway place, and the child had written such an angry poem. And I called the child and said, would you like to change it? This was not a child, this was a teenager. And he said, no, you said that we can write whatever we want, and this is exactly how I feel. He said, my family is a jail, and I am in a cell. And, so I didn't say anything. I immediately agreed. But after the session, I showed this to the principal, and she later told me that we had a session and there was something disturbing the child. So this was a good way of the child express his or her anger and sorrow as a poem. So poetry is a very useful tool, not only for entertainment, but also to make us whole.
And this kind of a poem, the slow motion is so rare, is personally my own favorite poem.
Yes.
And I always feel that it's very relevant in nowadays times where actually we are all running. We are all running. The stress has come up with to this point, actually, because we are running behind something. If we accept ourselves the way we are, I'm okay. I'm okay the way I am.
Nobody wants to be slow. Everyone wants to be fast, and everybody wants to be famous in 5 minutes. I remember when I went to a workshop, this was some years ago, 9-year-old child, one child asked me, are you famous? And before I could even open my mouth, the one boy said, yes, I saw that you are on some social media and you are famous. So I was so taken aback, because at first when I was 9, we didn't have any of these opportunities, or I would say sometimes I think they are not opportunities, they are actually things that are not so ideal, So we have to teach children how to navigate through all these things, which may or may not, they have to be used judiciously. And sometimes, as you say, slow motion is so rare, but we need to go slowly. Children are growing up so fast now because of the things that are available to them. But for us, it was much slower. So I think we believe in slow motion.
Yeah. So, ma'am, over to you. This was one of the questions, and the others have already been answered in the course of your conversation.
Okay, so I'll go back to poetry, some more poetry. So as I was saying, that many of the Indian publishers, they don't believe that a poetry merits as a genre by itself. So it is always in a textbook, that it comes with what can I say, with stories and with academic grammar but I honestly believe that poetry is a a subject that can be studied by itself. It is studied at a much higher level. At the university level, there are courses in different kinds of poetry. But at the school level, unfortunately, children are, it's not considered to be worthy of its own as a genre by itself. It's just 1 or 2 poems. So children are not really introduced to all the wonderful things that poetry has to offer. So now I'm going to read out. So I have a poetry page. If anybody is on Instagram, of my own original poetry. It's called Lottle, L-O-T-T-L-E. Lottle is like a little, but a lot. So if you say something is a lottle means just like little, a lot. So it's called Lottle _kids_poetry. So there are more than 100 poems. These poems have not been published anywhere else, but they're just for Instagram, and they are short poems. They are interesting, amusing poems. So if anyone is interested, you can go and read. So sometimes I make poems from unusual words that there are many words in the English language that are not commonly used, and words which we don't use in our everyday language, but which still have interesting meanings. So this is one of the poems from my Instagram page. Did you cashinate today? Did you cashinate today? I did, and it was so much fun. I think that cachinnation is something that should be done daily by everyone. It fills your lungs with oxygen-rich air. It stimulates your muscles and your heart. And if you're feeling low or stressed out, cachinnation boosts your spirits and gives you a fresh start. And you don't need to join a gym to cashinate or go for a long session in a fancy spa. All you need to do is open your mouth and say, ha, 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 because cachinnation is another word for having a loud guffaw. So cachinnation is a word for laughing. So this was a poem using an unusual word. I will also read some of the other poems from some of the other books. So I had already read you a poem about Mr. Moon's coat. So this is another, you can write, sometimes I do this, you take one topic and you can write 3 different poems on the same topic. There are many different ways of looking at the same thing. So already I have read you a poem where Mr. Moon's coat, I read you about his blue coat. So this is another poem. This is by widely used in the primary classes and the CBSE board. Tell me why, Mr. Moon. Mr. Moon, when I look up at you every night, there's so much I would like to know. From where do you get the wonderful silver light that makes you and your courtiers sparkle so? And during the day, when Mr. Sun blazes bright, where do you and all your twinkling stars go? Do you try to catch some sleep when you are out of sight before coming back to glimmer and glow? And Mr. Moon, what really puzzles my mind is the funny way you seem to shrink and then grow. Every month I find that you go from being fat and round to a slim, curved bow. So perhaps, Mr. Moon, perhaps one day I will reach your palace with a great flying leap, but I won't bother you or even stay. All I want is one little peep. So that was a poem about the moon. And before I end up, I'm going to show you, this is my book, To Catch a Poem. It's a new book that has just been released not even 2 weeks ago. It's available on Amazon, and it is a project that I worked on for many years, and there are more than 100 poems in it of 27 different types. So they're all for children. They've never been published before. There are question poems where the whole poem is made of questions. There are list poems, there are recipe poems, there are poems with different rhyming schemes, there are haikus, there are limericks, there are poems with monorhyme, poems with alliteration. There are more than 25 different types of poetry. And at the beginning of each chapter, there's a little introduction which will help the readers to write poetry. Now, the book is called To Catch a Poem, and this is the introduction to the book. And I'm going to read this poem to you. I want to catch a poem. I'm not sure how. I wish I knew when and where I could catch a poem right now. Can I catch a poem in the sand on a beach or hiding in fields of long green grass? Can I catch a poem among the waves in the sea? I'm not sure where I can catch a poem. Alas, will I be able to catch a poem with a loop of rope? Will I be able to use the rope to lasso and bind the poem up tight? Will I be able to catch a poem with a butterfly net? Will the net stop the poem from slipping out of my sight? Can I catch a poem when I'm playing outdoors? Or can I catch a poem from under my bed? Oh gosh, as I thought about where I can catch a poem, I actually caught one. It was right inside my own head. So this is To Catch a Poem, and I hope that if you are interested in catching a poem yourself, you can buy the book. And I hope that if you have any doubts on how you can catch a poem, please leave your comment in the chat box. I have a Facebook author page. Please write to me. I hope that I have inspired many of my readers to go out and catch a poem too.
Thank you so much. I'm sure, ma'am, I'm sure. It has inspired me. I think I consider myself not so writers or the poetic kind. But yes, even I have been thinking all this while of different things that I can write about, different, poetic forms that I can write, especially when you said doing a poetry from a story or just like writing a 5-line limerick or something like that. So that sounds like a very doable and a very simple option to begin with. So this was indeed a wonderful session, and a lot can be done with poetry. And on this World Poetry Day, Madhuban Educational Books, we would want to encourage all our educators, all the students, if parents are seeing this live session, and if we could reach out to as many people as possible and encourage them to write poetry, not only for children, even for the adults. Writing poetry, expressing your emotions. The whole problem nowadays is where we don't express ourselves. We don't learn how to express. So expressing in a written form, writing as a poetry, and nowadays, a poetry is what is made into songs or into raps or into any other literary or art.
Even advertisements, we know the catchy advertisements are all poems that are set to music.
They're set to music, so all of them. So you can all, and I'm sure a lot of you are watching all these poetry poems set to music on TikTok, on these YouTube reels and Facebook reels. So a lot of them get viral. So even if we want to be against the slow motion and be fast, I think poetry is a good way nowadays. So with this, encouraging everybody to write poetry. We have a small competition that we're going to start today. So just like ma'am said, and ma'am read out a story made into a poem from The Hare and the Tortoise, and a lot of other stories that ma'am converted, real life experiences that she's converted, and she's created beautiful poetry out of this. Similarly, if you would like to create a poem out of a story, we would love to hear that. So here is a invite to do that. And we begin this by saying, always be a poet, even in prose. So this was a beautiful quote by Charles Baudelaire, and we would like everybody to put on their creative caps. So from today, we turn on this a competition and an activity open to everyone. So you can convert a story into a poem, you can make certain changes, or you can create your own poem and share it with us at the given email ID, creativeminds@madhubanbooks.com. or send it to us on WhatsApp at the given number, and we will publish your poem on our social media platforms. And that will be one of our efforts in making you famous in 5 minutes, like ma'am has been talking about. So this will be a small effort from Madhuban Educational Books to bring out the poet in everybody who's watched this session, or anybody you know in your contacts and relations. This is a small effort from our end. Santani ma'am, thank you so much for being with us and making it such a lively session and such an interesting session. I think my audience has stayed glued to this session ever since we began.
I hope everyone enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. I love poetry. So thank you for the invitation. Good luck to everyone. I hope all of you take part in the competition and hope that we'll have many, many people catching new poems.
Absolutely. And looking forward to some more interesting real life experiences put to poetry.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. Stay healthy, stay happy, stay blessed.